Amy Matthews, and this is the English Heritage Podcast. Thanks for joining me. We're returning to our special mini-series on England's coasts today, this time reaching into the Tudor period, a time of religious, social and cultural transformation, but also war, and lots of it. From internal conflicts to foreign fracas with France, Scotland and Spain, this was the era when modern sea warfare evolved and innovated. So what has this got to do with the English coastline? To help me uncover the essential role of our watery edges with warfare and some particularly fascinating buildings, I'm joined by English Heritage's Dr. Andrew Roberts and Dr. Kathryn Bedford. How are you both today?
Good, thank you.
Good.
Yeah, doing great, thanks.
Lovely to have you and thank you so much for being here. Now, Andrew, how did you get into your line of work and your special interest? Let's get a bit of background in how you arrived here.
Oh, serendipity, just completely by accident. So I was once an academic of sorts, sort of doing a PhD in ancient history, and I saw a fantastic looking job at curating for English Heritage, and I applied for it, and now I'm here looking after mainly the Roman sites, but I also dabble elsewhere.
We're dabbling in Tudors today.
As we'll find out today.
That's very exciting. And how about you, Kathryn? What's your background? How did you get into your passion point?
I'm similarly slightly by accident.
Yeah.
I trained as a medievalist, that's what my PhD is in, and I originally joined English Heritage as a curator with a medieval specialism. Since then I have expanded and I now cover sites literally from Stonehenge all the way through to the Cold War.
That's fantastic. Well, like this podcast and like English Heritage, the span of history that we cover is broad and gorgeous and rich. But today we are drilling down into our Tudor history and warfare on the coastline specifically. Before we get into our object, as we always start with our object and sort of jump off point, before we get into that, I want to establish the importance of the coastline specifically in this period, because as much as the ports were for trade and for people travelling and the import and export of ideas and people, it's also a front line at this point, isn't it? So could you tell me a little bit about how that's manifested in this particular time?
Well, the reason why this is manifest is because Henry VIII has a tendency throughout his reign to involve himself in the affairs of Northern Europe. Okay, so amidst his many marriages, his many wars, he also is then forced to oversee something of a revolution in coastal defence. Henry is England is not a particularly big power in this period. The two major powers of Europe are Spain and France, and they're at war sporadically over the course of Henry's early reign. So Henry effectively tries to intervene, allying himself with Charles V at one point, and of Spain, and Francis I of France, and trying to sort of worm his way in there.
So he sees these major powers, wants a piece of the pie.
Yes.
And does so by wading in.
Yes, by wading in. But then events are somewhat overtaken by Henry's great matter, which of course is his marriage, and specifically his marriage to Kathryn of Aragon. So by the 1530s, the Pope has convinced France, the King of France, the King of Spain, to essentially give up their particular beef and unite against Henry and potentially go and try and remove him from power. So coastal defence now becomes paramount in Henry's mind, and he's sort of forced to kind of think about how he wants to prevent a seaborne invasion.
Lots of us do think of Henry in the context of his wives or the Reformation. Can we situate this particular aspect of his history and his reign within the Reformation?
Very much so. The suppression of the monasteries provides an influx of money to Henry's coffers at a time when he really needs it for his defensive structures. But in a far more visceral sense, you've actually got physical movement. We've got evidence within the structures of these castles themselves of reuse of building materials from the monastery, carved stone, floor tiles, even pieces of window glass that have been literally taken from a monastic setting and put into this new coastal defensive system.
So our starting object today looks pretty decorative. It doesn't look too military to my uninitiated eye. We've got a stone carving, I suppose, that's very symmetrical. I think has seen better days, which we can forgive it for, given its Tudor timing. But we've got two what looks to me quite mythical creatures framing a centralised maybe shield or a bit of armour. So what exactly am I looking at here?
You're looking at a coat of arms from above the gateway at Yarmouth Castle, one of the forts we'll be looking at today. And on either side, you've got a dragon on the right-hand side, so nice and mythical. But on the left, we do have a lion.
Much more real.
Much more real. The object that we've selected for this episode is the royal coat of arms that was on the front of every single one of these castles. So this is a very particular political statement that is being made. He's making this run of coastal forts, which are for a very practical purpose. He is expecting a measure of invasion. But then on the front of them, you have the royal coat of arms supported by the lion and the dragon, and around them, the Garter signal, which includes the phrase, Dieu et mon droit, God and my right. So
Fantastic.
That in itself is really quite a political statement in the context in which he is building these castles.
What's the significance of its composition, and what site am I looking at?
You're looking at a site on the Isle of Wight. It's one of very much the later Henrician device forts, but this sigil appears on the earlier ones as well. They doesn't necessarily survive in a lot of cases. Many of them it's either that part has come off, it's worn to the extent that it's unusable, or the building itself has been redesigned to the point that it's no longer present.
I see.
But it would be a familiar image to you if you could see it clearly.
So I used to live in Falmouth for a while, and am I right in thinking this is it on Pendennis Castle?
It certainly was once on Pendennis Castle. I think the location where we think it might have been is actually covered up by a later building.
So we've got layers of history.
Yeah, layers of history there, because they are
architecture.
The Pendennis is like Yarmouth, one of the Henrician forts.
So the phrase device fort, what exactly do we mean when we hear this?
So the prospect of invasion prompted Henry to consider how best to defend England's coast. So the first thing he does is he sends out a whole bunch of aristocrats called commissioners to make an assessment of the existing coastal defences, which had been assembled in a somewhat piecemeal fashion, and then also try to consider where England's vulnerabilities were. So estuaries, places where there might be a protected harbour. And then armed with all of that information, they embark on a whole programme of construction. So this includes blockhouses, which are sort of gun emplacements that are able to kind of fire across rivers, etc. And the centerpiece of this are these great artillery forts, such as Pendennis, St. Mawes, Deal, and Walmer. And these are what we term the device forts, essentially, because the whole plan is the device of the king at the devising of the king. So the invasion prompts Henry to consider how best to defend the English coast. And so he engages officials, these called commissioners, basically aristocrats at the court of Henry, to go out to the coastline and to basically survey what already exists in terms of defences, which have been built up on a very kind of ad hoc basis, but then also try to understand where there are potential vulnerabilities, where an invasion fleet could potentially anchor, where you might find that they could establish, say, something of a stronghold. And then once this is done, they come up with this plan to build fortifications, to muster soldiers in order to protect these particular locations. There are some major earthworks at various different points, but the core of this are these forts, which are of a new sort of design to what has been done previously. So that would include Pendennis, St Mawes, which is just across a body of water called the Carrick Roads in Cornwall, Deal and Walmer down in Kent, essentially.
Okay. And I mean, England's coast has always been a point of contact and obviously potential conflict by default as well with the wider world. So what makes these fortifications different or special or an evolution or innovation?
Well,
both of you.
First of all, thinking about the particular kind of design of it, to the sort of the uninitiated eye, they have the sort of the trappings of traditional castles that you might see in the medieval period. So they're made of stone in the main. They have walls. Sort of, if you're just looking at them, they look almost like a small keep of a medieval castle. Okay, and they have to maybe drawbridges and portcullises and things like that.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff, yeah. It looks like a castle. However, okay, by the 16th century, castle architecture is essentially antiquated. And the reason for that is because armies and, to a certain degree, navies now have artillery. So there has to be something of an evolution in terms of fort architecture.
They need an upgrade.
Yeah, so instead of having high walls and large keeps, the device forts have short, squat central towers surrounded by bastions, which again are quite large and squat and are big enough, and they're essentially filled. They're not hollow like a lot of castle walls. They're filled so that they can be platforms for cannon, large artillery. So essentially, they can kind of fire back at these land sieges or against boats themselves. But then the device forts have this kind of extra special aspect to them because they're beautiful.
Yeah.
They're geometric. If you were to sort of draw the plans of Pendennis and Walmer and Deal, etc., next to each other, you would almost think that you were looking at a taxonomy of flowers or something like that. It doesn't look as though it's kind of military, does it? But at the same time, the design is intended that they're going to have teeth. Essentially, the device forts are built on circular and semicircular structures. But actually, that's not the most efficient way of defending.
Right.
It's far more efficient to fire a gun down a straight line. So you find that the later forts have more straight lines and then what are called angle bastions. So I'm going to sort of hold this up for those that are watching. You might have more of a kind of a pointed bastion, which is easier to defend than a rounded bastion where you have to have multiple points from which you would fire.
Of course. Okay, I understand. Yeah. So functional and beautiful.
I mean, the other thing to say is that even in that early set of fort building, they are all different. There are only two of them that are the same design.
Yeah.
They're all unique castles or forts in their own right.
Exactly, So the reason why these are different from what's gone previously is first because this is a comprehensive approach to coastal defence. So we've had castles built in England before by, say, Edward I. We've got the Normans. You might even go back as far as, famously the Normans.
To an extent, the Romans as well.
Yes, I was going to go back to the Romans. So in fact, there's a whole dedicated episode to considering the program of coastal fortifications built by the Romans in the south and the southeast of England. But this is on another scale. With the Romans, we're talking about maybe a dozen or so, perhaps. This is 40 or so different coastal locations. And crucially, although there is some specific differences in how they are designed, it is very much a centralized program. So they're all done according to the same principles, which seems to be coming from Henry and his immediate circle. So he probably has some aristocratic advisors. We think that he brought in some professional fort designers from the continent as well to help him out. And then those principles are then sent away to the different locations where you have the people in charge who are tasked with executing them. And they come up with slightly different solutions depending on the context.
And that's where we get the individuality and the uniqueness.
Exactly.
Understood.
Yeah.
So it's a centralised programme, and then each of these sites and professionals obviously put their own imprint and take on them.
And the there's two of them that are the same, and the reason for that is they are part of a broader defensive structure along the coast, where you can effectively think of three of these forts and the bulwarks that Andrew mentioned in between as one piece of designed, and the ones on either side are identical to one another, and the one in the centre is different.
Is that just for symmetry? Is that purely...
It's presumably associated with the fact that it's the same people designing them in this case, but they have a particular function, so the function in this location suggests this design.
That's fascinating. So you mentioned there that there were 40, or 40 odd, potentially. How many of these still stand? How many can we go and visit?
Well, they're in very variable states of repair. Yeah. Camber, for example, you can go and see the outside, but the inside is really far too damaged for people to access these days. Sandown is completely destroyed, but there are a number of others that are still accessible. There's still some at Tilbury, but it's not a lot of it.
It's not a lot. Tilbury is rebuilt a bit later. And so what you see at Tilbury is a very impressive fort, which is very interesting, but it's not necessarily the Henrican establishment.
Hurst, Kelshut, Yarmouth within our patch, Deal and Woolmer, obviously.
And then, of course, as you said, in Pendennis, you have Pendennis and St. Maur's as well. Yeah.
I think there's as much, well, for me, certainly, when you visit these sites that are in ruin, there's as much magic and, stimulation to be had in those sites as well, though, aren't there? Because you can, well, one, I think it lends itself to the storytelling and the imagination when you get to fill in the blanks a little bit yourself. You can imagine what it would have been like in former glory. But so I think those sites have as much merit to go and visit as these ones that have been like fully restored.
Absolutely. And you have to bear in mind as well that often the ones that are very in good nick now, the reason for that is that they have been used and reused and adapted an awful lot over the years. So actually going to Camber Castle, to a greater extent, you are seeing the original Henrican castle far more than if you went to one of the sites that is in better condition.
Definitely.
Yeah, and the flip side of that is that they are retained, but they evolve according to the needs of the day. So Pendennis, for example, this was used all the way up into the 20th century. And what that tells you is that, to a certain extent, while the specific design of those forts is antiquated, almost before they're built, what Henry and his commissioners got right was the placement and the need, the urgency to think about coastal defence.
Yeah.
And that's, I would say, is what Henry's legacy is.
That makes sense. And I mean, you mentioned there as well that this program was a response, a reaction to evolving warfare and specifically like technological advance and artillery and guns and obviously the weapons of warfare changing. Could either both of you expand a little bit more on what those technological advances were specifically and how they were manifesting?
Okay. The big thing here is guns. Guns. They are thinking very much in terms of these structures are supposed to be defended from and defended by cannon. Yeah. It has to be said that the lovely designs that they drew at the time were a little bit over-enthusiastic about the number of cannon that would be available.
I understand.
I should say, you also have to have people to fire the cannon.
Yeah, crucially.
as well. Henry has this grand plan for 140 cannon. And actually, there's what we think is like a sketch made of what it might look like. Yeah. And it looks effectively like a porcupine. There's so many guns, they're almost kind of on top of each other.
But for example, at Deal Castle, we've got inventory records that show how many guns were there at different points. And in 1547, we know that far from that wonderfully large number of guns, there was in actual fact about 60. And when I say 60, they are not all the same kind of guns. Do not imagine the big black cannon necessarily that you think of when you think of a cannon of this period. Of those, there are a few of those big ones. Then they get gradually smaller and smaller and smaller. And some of them, I think it's 7, they're actually guns that are designed to be used on ships rather than on land. And about 20 of them are a kind of gun that if you looked at it, you would think it was a really large rifle. It's sort of got a wooden it's just too heavy for one person to hold, so it's supported. So only actually sort of 2/3 of these guns are the kind of big cannon that you would think of on those terms. There are far more of the old-fashioned kinds of weapons still around. At the same time, there were 87 bows available to the garrison. There were 242 halberds or bills, which is a kind of polearm. Imagine like an axe on a 2-metre-long stick with a spike at the end.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you'll have seen them. And there's also about 160 pikes, which are a single sharp spike on the end of a stick that is 4 to 7 metres.
Right.
So they're 2 different kinds of pole arms intended for different levels, different distances. So the quantity of those, so that's about 400 pole arms compared to 60 of the large guns.
Yeah.
They're still very much focused around that. And in addition to those in the storerooms, any individual member of the garrison also had to have their own weaponry. And I'm actually going to read you a quote from the audiences of the castle.
Please,
here.
we love a quote. We love a voice from the past.
Okay. Every one of the said garrison furnish himself with convenient weapons as a dagger and a sword with a halbert or bull, and also harness, which is kind of armour, personal defence, and also every gunner should have a handgun. And they had to present this weaponry that they had provided themselves to the captain for inspection to prove that they had it.
That leads really nicely actually onto my next question, because building a picture of these forts themselves, was it just soldiers garrisoned here, or were there communities attached to these sites?
In a lot of cases, because of the fact that they are specifically designed as defensive structures for the fort, they're actually in pre-existing communities rather than necessarily communities growing up around them.
Understood.
As you'd have seen in an earlier period. There was what you might think of as a standing garrison in each case, but these are quite small numbers. This might be just 17, 19 people that are there largely full-time, and they're not even necessarily all of them living within the castle. So the captain and the lieutenant, for example, would be gentlemen with large private residences in the area. They would not be there all the time. The standard soldiers, you'd certainly have some of them living within the castle. And, for example, we know at Walmer, there is a basement level that's for storage. The ground floor is where the gunners would stay originally. The first floor is for the captain, and then the roof is a defensive structure. So the captain, in spite of the fact he's not there, gets half the space.
Yeah. That scans. Yeah.
And also, just to kind of add on to that, it's likely that it's not just soldiers and men. Now, we don't necessarily have the best evidence for the Tudor period specifically, but certainly from some of the research I've done towards the end of the 17th century, or many of these garrisons are still in place, there were certainly the families of maybe the governors or the captains, certainly the high officials, that might have been in and around the garrison as well. Whether they're living there permanently is another matter. It may be that the well-to-do had a house in town, but certainly there are some records of there being the wives and the children accompanying
spending time there
officers, and spending time there at least.
From an objects point of view, it can be quite difficult in these kinds of military contexts to identify female objects unless they are sort of items of personal adornment. So, for example, at Camber Castle, we've got surviving thimbles and dressmaking pins and things, or sewing pins, things like that. But whether they would have been used by women or whether the male garrison would have had the skills to do textile repairs on their own clothing isn't something that you could clearly say. Whereas you would probably in a domestic setting assume that they were owned by women.
We
in
can't make that assumption.
You can't do that. But for example, we also have a female ring, and from the sizing we can say that is definitely female, and from the style.
And so obviously we've covered the fact that Henry has rolled out this huge innovation, this huge programme. So how much action did these device forts actually get in their time?
Very little direct action. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't worth it, okay?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So there isn't that the threatened invasion, as we've kind of hinted about, almost before the device forts, the original building program is finished. the fresh invasion goes away. However, slightly later, there is an invasion, which gets as far as the Isle of Wight, where they don't have a fort, and that is ultimately dealt with, and then that leads to a further reassessment of the defences there, and leads, I think, to the building of Yarmouth. So it's quite interesting that, as Kathryn was telling us, that by the time we get into the later Tudor period under Elizabeth, during Elizabeth's reign, the early years of Elizabeth's reign, there's not a lot of threats to England, but particularly from the 1580s, there is a threat of invasion, a very real threat of invasion from Spain, who are effectively trying to restore Catholicism and remove Elizabeth, who was a Protestant queen, from power. And of course, in 1588, there is the Spanish Armada, which is a vast fleet sent from Spain to pick up soldiers and to hopefully land in Britain. And the forts are going to be made ready, but so is the English fleet. And as it happens, it's the English fleet that managed to harry the Armada. But ultimately, it's the weather that defeats it. So they're not tested in earnest at this time.
I see. I love the fact that something built to defend a country against armies, it feels appropriate that on an English coastline it would be defeated by the weather. Like, that's really perfect.
Just as well, by that later point, there's even fewer guns. There's about 7 of them at that stage.
There we go. I have to ask as well, just bringing it to slightly more modern history, did they ever see any of the action that they were prepped for?
Yes, sort of, but they're all slightly weird examples. Okay,
Great.
So in 1639, there is the Battle of the Downs, and the Downs is an area of the sea just off the coast from Deal and from Walmer, and Sandown, where there are these 3 very powerful forts. But it doesn't involve the English Navy, okay, and it's not Britain that's being attacked here. It's actually a naval engagement between the Dutch and the Spanish, and the Spanish sort of sail in and to try and they sort of step on the neutrality of the anchorage, and the forts at Deal, I think Walmer as well, perhaps. Certainly Deal fires on the Spanish ships and sinks some of them. Okay. So they do work.
And they saw action, but just not the action that anybody had anticipated.
And then about a decade later, they are besieged by the English, because of course in the 1640s, this is the period of the English Civil War, and so places like Deal and Walmer and Pendennis as well in Cornwall, they're forced to kind of pick a side. So the castles of Deal and Walmer, they declared for the king.
Okay.
And Parliament sent a force to besiege them. And it's a great point of pride with the castle of Deal that Walmer very quickly conceded to the parliamentary army, but Deal holds out under bombardment, hoping essentially be relieved by royalist forces, which arrive, but they fail to relieve the siege. And so Deal is ultimately forced to surrender.
I do kind of love the fact that these coastal defences are only attacked from the land. The only time that happens.
Yeah, no, and I think
so true.
So I think it's actually really interesting, because you could say that on the face of it that they fail, but actually they're not trying to combat what they were meant to combat.
Yes.
Somebody English is supposed to be coming to rescue you if you get attacked by a foreign power. But in this context, in the context of Civil War, it's a little bit more complex.
They didn't see the action that Henry had anticipated, but they saw action just in a different way. Yes. You confirmed there that they were reappropriated for the world wars during the 20th century, or some
There's a lot of Napoleonic defensive structures that get added on. So if, for example, you were to go to Hurst or Calshot today, what you initially see is actually Napoleonic. But then they also remain in use during the world wars. So, for example, there were some really quite large coastal defensive guns placed at Hurst Castle. If you go there today, you can still see a Twin 6, which is now inside because it's such a rare gun. There's only one one of only 3 that survives in the world, and this is the only one still in Europe.
And we don't want to leave that to English weather. We've seen the damage it can do.
So there are these guns that are placed in exactly the same locations as the Henry VIII device forts in the larger superstructures that are being constructed around them.
Fantastic. And I think as we've brought these features and this point in history, we've situated it really nicely in the modern day and how they sort of survive today. Just as we bring our conversation to a close, do either of you want to add any either special points of interest or passion points that you have about this particular area?
I'd really like to talk a little bit about the Camber Castle collection, because I mentioned earlier that Camber is very much ruinous now. And that's because coastal changes meant that it was no longer a useful fort. But what's really, really interesting as an archaeologist is that means that pretty much everything that was found there is Henrician. The entire collection speaks to this one period of use. And there are some absolutely fascinating objects in that collection, and particularly speaking to ongoing connections with explicitly Protestant Europe. There's imported ceramics that have come from Northern Europe, from Germany. And there is this absolutely wonderful tile stove, which was made somewhere in West Germany, probably. It has on it a picture of Philip I of Hesse, who was a great Protestant defender. And to give you an idea of the status of this object, this is the only one in Britain in a military context, and there was one at Westminster Palace. There's also cooking pots, tableware, that kind of very day-to-day side of things that is all from this one period, which allows you to, with this collection, speak to a very complete sense of that castle in the one period. I mean, there's even things like evidence of people making their own musket balls for the guns that they had to have. So, and in one case, what we actually appear to have is someone who didn't have enough lead. So they've surrounded a small pebble in lead to get something of the right size. So this kind of thing just very much goes straight to the people and what they're experiencing living there.
Absolutely, just improvising, all making our best. How about yourself, Andrew? Is there any other? Yeah,
well, I really love what Kathryn just said there, because it two things. At the top of the pod, I talked a little bit about how this is almost like the forgotten element of Henry's reign. We think wives, wars, religion, of course, dissolution of the monasteries. If we're going to think about building, we're thinking about his wonderful palaces that he built, many of which now no longer exist or have been obscured by later palaces. But considering these forts brings us sort of another element to consider when we consider Henry's reign. And to kind of nuance what we said at the beginning, it's not just about an establishment of a coastal defensive program. It's actually about the establishment of communities.
Absolutely. I think you've summarised that so perfectly. A big thank you to Andrew and Kathryn for joining me. Keep a lookout for new episodes in this series dropping soon on your regular podcast feed, with video available on Spotify and the English Heritage YouTube channel. Follow, review, and join us next time.